Hey everybody, it's Rory from A&S Gear, and today we're going to learn how to do some general maintenance on your paintball markers. All right, so today we're going to look at trigger adjustment on an Etek 5, which is pretty straightforward. There is not a lot of adjustment available for it, but we will go over what is available, what you can and can't do. Well, basically what you can do, and you guys can take what you can't do from there. So let's get the grips off. Here. I'm going to pull the trigger completely out so that you can see what's going on inside of there. All right. Oh, I'm taking that off. Let's see if I can get this off. Hey, there you go. So from here, if we want to, normally you wouldn't need to take the frame off here. I'm going to take the frame off just so I can pull the trigger out and you guys can see it. But you can do all adjustments for the trigger with the trigger sitting right where it is. Actually, I'm going to try something really quick. Never thought about doing it this way, but maybe we can. Yeah, look at that. So here's our trigger right there. We need to take the grips off so that you can get to this this roll pin, so it will slide out. You'd only technically need to take off one side and you could just slide it out, but it does need to come out of there. So here's our trigger. This is our pin that normally sits inside our trigger right there. This is where the trigger pivots when we push on it. Bing, 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 bing. The back side of the trigger right here is the point that actually pushes against the micro switch that is inside the gun. So our micro switch being right here, this is the part that goes clicky, clicky, click right there, and this pushes against it. So inside the gun, we've got two adjustments on the top right here, two screws that you can adjust. And those are adjusted from the bottom with your 1/16 Allen key. And normally you just stick that right up there and do it. So inside your gun, you can see right in there, right here, is a magnet that sits right there. Okay, so this is the return for your trigger. This is what brings your trigger back to its original starting point. Now, the micro switch does help. When the micro switch comes back forward after you've pulled the trigger, the micro switch has a little bit of spring to it, so it pushes the trigger back a little bit, but not a lot. This magnet attracting to this front screw is what pulls the trigger back. Now, by adjusting this screw, you can control the amount of attraction between this set screw and the magnet. So if you want it to be tougher to break away because it's closer to the magnet, you can make your trigger a little stiffer to break away and return a little snappier. If you want it loose, you can bring the magnet down so it's not as attracted to it, and the trigger will be a little bit sloppier, I guess, or just loosey-goosey. Now, by adjusting this front screw too far in, you can actually change the pivot position of the trigger. But it's up to you. You got to just play around with it. Now, the second screw that you see on the top, so the one sitting right behind it, is actually the screw that you would use to change the starting position, or what they call the resting position of the trigger. So if you are not touching the trigger in any way, by adjusting this front screw up or into the trigger this way, so towards me, it's going to push the trigger backwards, because this screw is going to push up against right behind that magnet in the gun, and as it pushes against that housing right there, the trigger is going to start to rotate backwards. If you bring the screw out this way, so away from the trigger, it'll bring the trigger back this way. So you can control where the trigger sits by adjusting this second screw. Now, one thing about this, if you adjust this screw too far in and the trigger moves all the way back, it is possible to have the trigger resting on the micro switch to the point where the micro switch is being depressed and the gun thinks that you're holding the trigger down even though you're not. So be careful as to how far you bring the trigger back and how it sits on that micro switch. And a lot of people go like, oh, I want a hair trigger. I want it to be so easy to pull the trigger. That's actually not a good trigger position. Having the trigger set so close to the micro switch that you barely touch it and the micro switch goes off is not conducive to high rates of fire or consistent rates of fire. You want a little bit of trigger movement, trigger play, both before and after activation. We're not shooting real guns here. All right, so these two, this controls return and magnet or trigger breakaway strength, and this one controls starting position. The next screw hole that you see is this one that is right here. This one does nothing. This is the screw that when your post is in, you tighten this screw down and it will lock against the post so that the post doesn't fall out anymore. So this one right here does nothing for trigger control. All it does is keep the post from falling out and keep your trigger from falling out. Last one is down here on the bottom. This is ending or stopping position. So as we rotate the trigger back, we're pulling on it and the trigger is moving backwards. This will control how far the trigger moves before it stops. And this screw just bumps up against this bottom piece right here of the frame. So if I put this back in here, you can see that as the trigger wants to rotate down like that, let me put the post back in here. Oop, fell right off the bottom. Let me get my thumb in the way. Right there, as the trigger rotates back, you'll get to a point where if you had this screw in, the screw would bump up against the frame and it would keep it from moving further. Now that's going to control how far the trigger can move this way before it stops. And you can see back in here, the back of the trigger poking through and pushing on that micro switch back in there. So we don't want, what you want to try to avoid at all times is setting up the trigger to the point where the trigger can come through and hit the micro switch and then keep traveling after activation on the micro switch to the point where the back of the trigger, which you can see right in there, starts to force itself up against the micro switch housing. I've seen a lot of people set their trigger to the point where it can activate the micro switch and then move too far and hit the housing. And then when they start pulling the trigger or pulling it hard, they actually crack the housing of the micro switch and they end up breaking it. And then they go, oh, it must, it's defective, it broke. Well, no, you just didn't have your trigger set up properly and you smashed your micro switch. So with this trigger, the way it's set up right now, it moves, it activates right there, and now after my activation here, I've got a little bit more trigger play, trigger movement before this screw hits the frame. And it's not to the point where my micro switch is completely bottomed out. I've still got some play. I'm trying to let you guys see that in there. Maybe I'll use my pick. I'm going to tighten this down so I don't have to hold it in place. That will be a smart idea. There. There you go, you can see it right there. So you can hear the activation of the micro switch right there. But if I hold the switch or the trigger completely down, I'm forcing it all the way down so that the screw that is right here is hitting the frame, and I go inside here, there's still, this is hard to do backwards, there's still some play to the micro switch. So I am not bottoming out the micro switch on its own housing. There's still some movement to it, so I still even have, I can have the trigger move even further back if I wanted it to before I'm pushing against the actual housing of the micro switch. And that is very important because you don't want to break your micro switch off there. You'd have to end up replacing the whole board. But that's it. When it comes to trigger adjustment for an Etek 5, there isn't, it isn't complicated. There's not a lot going on there. Just a couple things to adjust. Hope that helps. Trigger adjustment for an Etek 5.